Imagine building your entire home with nothing but mud, sticks, sweat, and the hope that winter wouldn't kill you. Now picture doing all of that while owning almost nothing, yet somehow creating a warm, living shelter that lasted generations. Chapter 1. The harsh world of the medieval peasant builder. Before a single handful of mud touched the wooden frame, before the first straw was mixed or the first stick was cut, a peasant faced a reality most of us today can hardly imagine. Building a house wasn't a creative project or a fun weekend task. It was survival itself. A home was the thin line between life and death, between raising a family or burying one. For a medieval peasant, the world was cruelly simple. No home meant no future. Imagine waking up on land you didn't own, soil you worked for someone else, while the sky above offered no promises. Rain meant flooding. Winter meant hunger. A broken roof meant sickness. But even in that hardship, peasants carried a quiet, stubborn hope, the belief that if they could just build something sturdy enough, warm enough, dry enough, life might soften its grip. Just a little. Most peasants had nothing but their hands, a bit of wood, some wild grasses, and whatever earth lay beneath their feet. But in their hands, mud wasn't just mud. Straw wasn't just straw. These were the ingredients of life. They were the tools that would protect children, store food, shelter animals, and stand bravely against storms. Despite what people sometimes imagine, medieval peasants weren't helpless or unskilled. They were resourceful, observant, and surprisingly clever builders. They knew how the wind moved across a valley, which side of a hill stayed dry, which soil held together, which trees bent without breaking. This knowledge wasn't written in books, it was learned through generations of watching, trying, failing, and learning again. And the stakes were high, because there were no construction stores, no hired carpenters, no architects drawing plans. If you wanted a house, you gathered your neighbors and built one. The community's survival depended on every family having shelter. A collapsing roof wasn't just a personal problem. It weakened the entire village. So, when a young family needed to build, the whole community stepped in, lifting beams together, hauling mud together, laughing, arguing, sweating together. The ground chosen for building was almost sacred. A peasant would walk the land, slowly, watching where the morning sun hit first, where water collected after rain, feeling the texture of the soil between their fingers. Would it crack? Would it crumble? Would it hold a wall? This simple act, kneeling in dirt, determined the fate of the home for decades to come. Once the spot was chosen, the family cleared the land themselves. Every root, every stone, every clump of grass had to go. Children carried sticks, adults carried logs. And as the land was cleared, hope began to take shape, just a bare outline in the soil, but a promise nonetheless. It's easy to forget that peasants didn't build houses to be perfect. They built houses to protect. Walls didn't need to impress anyone. They needed to stop wind. Roofs didn't need to be beautiful. They needed to shed rain. Floors didn't need to shine. They needed to stay dry enough to prevent disease. The standards were simple, but the work was anything but. In those early days of building, life didn't pause. Women stirred pots over fires while helping carry straw. Men swung axes but also tended fields or mended tools. Children gathered anything useful, twigs, reeds, bits of grass, knowing every handful mattered. The home was built between all the other demands of life, squeezed into moments stolen from exhaustion. And yet, there was joy in it. The laughter of neighbors teasing each other. The pride of seeing a frame rise from nothing. The excitement of imagining the first night inside the kaya. Finished home, warm and safe, no longer at the mercy of open skies. But before any of that could happen, before a roof, before a floor, before even the first layer of mud, one essential element had to rise from the earth, the skeletal wooden frame that would hold everything together. And that, as the peasants knew well, was the most dangerous and demanding task of all. How did they lift heavy beams with no machines and almost no tools? Chapter 2 reveals the surprisingly brilliant technique behind mud houses, Wattle, Daub, and the miracle mixture that held entire lives together. Chapter 2: Mud, Straw, and Miracles. The secret formula of Wattle and Daub. Before a single wall could rise, Peasants needed to master a material that, by all logic, shouldn't have worked as well as it did. Mud. The same wet soil we kick off our boots today was, for medieval peasants, nothing short of miraculous. But it wasn't just plain mud. They turned it into something far stronger, something capable of standing for decades. And the secret wasn't found in books or scrolls, but in instinct, experience, and a deep connection to the land. The technique they used was called Wattle and Daub. Though most peasants didn't know the name, they simply knew what their fathers and grandfathers had done before them. This works, tradition said, and so they continued doing it. Let's start with the wattle. This part was essentially a woven skeleton, a lattice of flexible branches, usually hazel or willow. Peasants didn't choose these woods by accident. They chose them because they bent instead of breaking. Even a child could weave them, threading branches over and under thicker posts until the whole structure looked like the beginnings of a giant basket. This weaving was the hidden magic of medieval walls. The wattle didn't just hold the mud, it gripped it. When storms pushed against the wall or when winter froze the ground, the wattle flexed just enough to keep the whole structure from cracking apart. In a world without steel, nails, or engineered support beams, this natural flexibility was priceless. Once the wattle was complete, the second ingredient, the daub, came into play. And this was where peasants transformed simple earth into something almost architectural. A proper daub mix required a peasant's version of alchemy. Mud or clay, the base, straw, for binding. Animal hair, for tensile strength, manure to help the mixture stick and dry smoothly. Water, just enough to bring it all together. To someone watching from afar, it must have been a strange sight. Entire families stomping barefoot in huge pits of mud, laughing, complaining, and mixing the ingredients like bakers kneading dough. Children were especially valuable here. Lighter feet, endless energy, zero hesitation about jumping into muck up to their knees. The mixture needed the perfect consistency. Too wet, and it slid off the wattle like soup. Too dry, and it fell apart before sticking. Peasants judged it not with tools, but with the touch of their hands. They squeezed it, rolled it, slapped it against wooden posts. If it clung stubbornly, almost defiantly, it was ready. Applying the daub was slow but strangely satisfying work. They took handfuls of the mixture, sometimes entire armfuls, and slapped it against the wattle. The sound of it hitting the wall echoed across the village, a wet, heavy thud that marked progress. They pressed it into every gap, every corner, every tiny hole where cold winter winds might slip through. Layer after layer built up, creating walls thick enough to hold heat and strong enough to withstand years of weather. As it dried, something remarkable happened. The mixture hardened, not into brittle stone, but into a firm, durable surface that resisted cracking. The straw inside acted like natural rebar, giving the wall flexibility. The manure helped bind everything together and kept pests away. Even the smell disappeared after drying in the sun, but the genius of wattle and daub wasn't just in its simplicity, it was repairable. If a wall cracked or a patch crumbled, peasants didn't panic. They simply mixed another batch of daub and pressed it in. Homes were living things, built, maintained, and healed by the same hands that lived inside them. And here's a surprising truth. Many of these wattle and daub walls lasted not just years, but centuries. Long after the peasants who built them had passed, the homes still stood, quiet witnesses to lives of resilience and sweat. But building the walls was only half the battle. These mud surfaces needed shelter of their own, protection from rain and rot, and that meant the roof, arguably the most dangerous, physically demanding step in house building. Before the walls had even fully dried, peasants were already thinking ahead. How do you lift a roof beam 3 times your weight without a single machine? And how do you thatch a roof so tightly that even winter winds can't find their way in? The answer lay in teamwork, courage, and a little bit of clever engineering. In Chapter 3, we watch the frame rise, beam by beam, as the whole village gathers to raise a house from nothing but sweat, wood, and willpower. In Chapter 3, raising a home with bare hands. The structure takes shape. Long before the mud could harden into walls or the thatch could crown the roof, The most intimidating stage of all had to be completed, raising the frame. This skeleton of timbers would decide whether the house would stand strong for decades or collapse in the first storm. And for peasants, who owned little more than simple axes and worn-out ropes, this challenge required both courage and community. The forest was their hardware store. Peasants walked among the trees not as wanderers, but as careful inspectors. They studied trunks with the eye of a craftsman, checking whether the wood was straight, how it grew, whether it had knots, or twists that might weaken it. They trusted their instincts, like modern builders trust measuring tools. A good frame started with good timber, and choosing it was a kind of ritual. Once chosen, the hard work began. Cutting a single large beam with medieval tools was brutal. The rhythm of the axe echoed through the forest, each strike sending vibrations up aching arms. Chips of wood flew, sweat stung the eyes, and every inch gained felt like a small victory. A full day might produce only a few usable beams. But peasants knew this was the foundation of their future. They weren't just cutting wood, they were cutting security, warmth, and hope. When the logs were finally ready, they hauled them back to the building site. And here, the whole village often joined in. 10, 15, even 20 hands grabbed ropes, pushing, pulling, rolling logs over uneven ground. There was laughter, shouting, the occasional insult yelled in good humor, but beneath it all, a deep understanding. Everyone's survival depended on everyone's help. Today they lift your beams, tomorrow you lift theirs. And then came the most delicate part, joinery. Medieval peasants, despite their lack of formal education, were surprisingly skilled woodworkers. They cut mortise and tenon joints, perfectly shaped sockets and pegs that allowed heavy beams to interlock without nails. Imagine carving puzzle pieces out of logs with only knives and axes, knowing that one mistake could mean a crooked frame or a dangerous collapse. Yet, peasants did this with confidence, guided by inherited knowledge and learned intuition. As the pieces took shape, the frame slowly formed on the ground, the upright posts first, then the crossbeams, then the braces. It was like watching a skeleton grow from the earth. Children were taught to stay back, but they often watched with wide eyes as their future home materialized in wood before them. Then came the most thrilling and risky moment, the raising. Raising a timber frame was the medieval equivalent of a community festival mixed with a dangerous construction mission. Everyone participated. Some pulled ropes, some guided beams, others wedged supports beneath rising timbers. When the first major post lifted off the ground, hearts raced. Men leaned their entire weight into ropes, legs braced in mud, breath held steady. The beam rose slowly, almost hesitantly, as if testing whether the village was truly strong enough. And then, thud. It dropped into its place, locked into the ground, standing tall like a wooden monument. A cheer often erupted, not a loud or dramatic one. Peasants rarely had the energy for that. But a tired, relieved cheer that said, "Yes, it's standing. We did it." One by one, the rest of the posts followed. Crossbeams were lifted on shoulders, pegs were hammered through joints with heavy mallets. When the final frame stood complete, its shape clear against the sky, the moment felt almost sacred. A home had been born, not finished, but alive. The frame already told the story of its builders. The heights of the beams revealed how tall the family wanted their ceilings. The angles of the roof hinted at how wet their winters were. Even the orientation, facing the sun, avoiding the wind, showed their knowledge of the land. Nothing was random. Everything was earned. But peasants weren't finished yet, not even close. Now that the skeleton stood, it needed flesh. The walls of mud, the insulation of straw, the final touches that would turn it from a structure into a shelter. Before they could add the wattle and daub, however, they had to give the house something even more vital, a roof that could defend it from rain, rot, and winter winds. And that was a challenge on its own, one that required height, balance, and a bravery peasants rarely acknowledged out loud. In Chapter 4, we climb onto the rising frame to watch peasants weave thatch, seal walls, shape clay floors, and finally turn a wooden skeleton into a warm, breathing home. Chapter 4. Thatch, clay floors, and smoke holes, turning a structure into a home. A timber frame standing alone in a field was impressive, but it wasn't a home, not yet. It still felt open, raw, exposed. Wind passed through it, rain mocked it. Birds landed on the beams like it was just another part of the landscape. But for peasants, this moment, the halfway point, was the most exciting stage of all. Because now, it was time to give the house its skin, its warmth, its personality. The first task was the roof, the shield against everything the sky could throw at them. And peasants didn't use tiles or shingles. Those were luxuries. They used thatch, bundles of reeds or straw, harvested from marshes or left over from crop fields. Thatch might seem fragile today, but in the medieval world it was a miracle material. Lightweight, extremely insulating, and surprisingly long-lasting when layered correctly. Gathering thatch was a communal event. Families waded waist-deep in marshes, cutting reeds with knives, stacking them into huge bundles tied with twine. Children carried smaller loads, feeling important. As the growing pile of golden straw rose under the sun, everyone could already imagine it hanging over their future home like a soft, protective blanket. Climbing onto the roof frame was not for the faint-hearted. Peasants didn't have ladders tall enough or scaffolding sturdy enough. They improvised. Rope slings, leaning poles, even each other's shoulders. One wrong step meant a broken leg, or worse. But up they went, gripping beams with calloused hands, balancing barefoot to maintain better traction on the smooth wood. Once at the top, the roofing began. Thatch wasn't simply tossed on. It was layered meticulously, starting at the bottom edge of the roof and working upward. Each bundle overlapped the one below it, creating a natural waterfall effect. Rain would slide off, effortlessly. The peasants tied the bundles to battens with rope or twisted straw cords, tightening each knot until the roof felt dense, thick, almost plush. From below, villagers watched the shape of the home transform. The sharp lines of the timber frame softened into rounded, almost cozy curves. The house no longer looked skeletal, it looked sheltered, protective, alive. After the roof came the ceiling of the walls. The wattle had already been woven, but the daub mixture, mud, straw, dung, hair, needed time to fully dry and harden. Peasants checked the walls constantly, running hands across them, feeling for soft patches that needed more daub. They sealed tiny cracks, smoothed bulges, improved corners. The walls became thicker with each layer until they resembled solid earthen barriers capable of holding warmth through brutal winters. Inside, the floor demanded attention. Most peasant houses didn't have wooden planks. Those required timber too valuable to waste. Instead, they built clay floors, a surprisingly durable, surprisingly comfortable surface. They tamped down the earth, poured buckets of clay slurry, and smoothed it with wooden paddles. As it dried, it hardened into a firm, slightly cool floor that could be swept, cleaned, even repaired. On top of it, they sometimes scattered rushes or reed mats to soften the surface and absorb dirt. But perhaps the most ingenious part of the house was the handling of smoke. Peasants didn't have chimneys, not at first. Chimneys came later, with wealthier households. Instead, the home relied on a smoke hole, often just a small opening in the roof or wall. Smoke from the cooking fire drifted upward, curling through the air, seeping into the thatch, drying it, and even helping preserve it from insects and rot. The interior often looked hazy, especially in winter, but the warmth was undeniable. Clothes hung, inside absorbed the scent of wood and earth, and families grew accustomed to the soft glow of smoke hovering above them like an old friend. With each addition, roof, walls, floor, smoke hole, the house felt less like a project and more like a living space. The shadows inside shifted differently. The air felt warmer, even the sounds changed. Wind no longer howled through the structure, but whispered. Outside, blocked by thick daub and gentle thatch. The final touches were small but meaningful, pegging the door in place, hanging herbs to dry near the beams, smoothing the earthen floor once more, and placing the first stones for a fire pit. These were the moments when peasants finally allowed themselves to breathe, to imagine the first night spent inside, the first meal cooked, the first winter, survived. But while the house was nearly complete, Living inside it presented challenges and surprises all its own. Cold nights, smoky air, pests, repairs. Medieval peasants had to adapt daily to keep their simple homes functioning. In Chapter 5, we step inside these mud-walled shelters to discover what daily life was really like. From sleeping arrangements to cooking methods to the unexpected comforts hidden within humble peasant homes. Chapter 5. Living inside the mud walls. Comfort, struggles, and daily survival. Once the mud walls had hardened, the roof had settled into place, and the smoke hole had begun its steady work of clearing the air. The house transformed from a construction site into something far more intimate, a living, breathing sanctuary. But stepping inside a medieval peasant home wasn't like stepping into a cozy cottage from a storybook. It was warm, yes, protective, absolutely. But life inside those humble walls was a dance, a constant balance between comfort and struggle. The moment you ducked under the low doorway, the first thing you noticed was the smell. A mixture of wood smoke, earth, dried straw, cooked porridge, and faint hints of livestock. It wasn't unpleasant, just alive. Every scent told a story. The smoke meant warmth, the earth meant safety, the straw meant insulation. And the animals? Well, they meant survival. Because many peasant homes, especially the poorer ones, weren't exclusively for people. On cold winter nights, goats or sheep often shared the space, separated only by a simple wooden partition or a raised platform. Their body heat was precious. A single sheep could raise the room's temperature by several degrees during the bitterest nights, and peasants weren't about to waste that blessing. Inside, the walls, though primitive in appearance, created an unexpected sense of security. The daub held warmth surprisingly well, especially once dry. Touch it with your hand, and you'd feel a firm, slightly rough texture, cool to the touch but steadfast. And because the walls were thick, the home stayed warmer in winter and cooler in summer than many people today imagine. The fireplace, or rather the central fire pit, was the heart of the home. There was no chimney, just the gentle path of smoke rising up toward the opening in the roof. The air inside was smoky, especially in early morning when the fire was rekindled. Peasants learned to live with the haze. Eyes watered sometimes, but not as much as you might think. Smoke rose slowly, weaving between rafters, making the air look almost mystical when the morning sun slipped through the cracks in the wall or roof. The smoke served more purposes than just warmth and cooking. It kept insects at bay, dried herbs hung from the rafters, and even helped preserve the timber beams. The inside of a peasant hut wasn't just inhabited, it was seasoned. Sleeping arrangements were simple but clever. Families didn't have individual bedrooms. Space was far too precious for that. Instead, they slept together, often piled, onto a single large bed platform filled with straw, wool, or dried grasses. Children slept closest to the warmest parts of the home, usually near the fire. Adults slept on the edges, ready to wake for chores or emergencies. Privacy didn't exist, but closeness meant warmth, and in winter, warmth meant life. Meals were equally humble but surprisingly hearty. A pot of stew might simmer for hours, even days, with new ingredients added daily. Bread was coarse, dark and filling. Beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, these were daily staples. Peasants didn't dine, they refueled. And they refueled together, sitting around the fire, sharing stories, whispering prayers, listening to the crackle of kindling. But life inside these homes wasn't without its hardships. Dampness could creep up the walls during wet seasons, creating that unmistakable earthy smell. Leaks in the thatch needed patching, sometimes in the middle of a storm. Pests, mice, insects, even birds, occasionally found their way inside. The smoke hole might clog with soot. The floor might crack and need smoothing again with fresh clay. Repairs weren't occasional. They were routine. A peasant home demanded constant interaction, constant care. But this wasn't viewed as a burden. It was simply life. You fixed things because fixing things meant another season survived. And despite all the imperfections, there were moments of true comfort. A warm corner by the fire after hours of work in winter frost. The soft glow of embers reflecting on mud walls. The feeling of lying down on a straw-filled bed, exhausted but safe, or the hush of rain tapping against the thatch while the family slept dry and warm beneath it. Living inside a mud house wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy, but it worked. It kept people alive. And for peasants who knew hunger and hardship far too well, that alone made it precious. Yet even as these homes protected generation after generation, change was coming. New materials, new techniques, new expectations. Slowly, the humble mud houses began to fade from villages and memory. In Chapter 6, we uncover why these homes eventually disappeared, and what their remarkable legacy teaches us about resilience, resourcefulness, and the art of building from almost nothing. Chapter 6. Why mud houses disappeared, and what they teach us. Today, for centuries, mud-walled, thatch-roofed peasant homes stood quietly across the landscape, humble silhouettes against fields of wheat and cold morning mist. They sheltered millions of families through storms, wars, bad harvests, and bitter winters. These houses were built with nothing but local earth, scraps of wood, and a kind of hope that only the poor could understand. And yet, despite their endurance and their astonishing practicality, one day, they simply began to vanish. Their disappearance didn't happen overnight. It was slow, almost invisible at first. A new tax law here, a wealthier landowner there, new building fashions spreading from towns into villages. Peasants who once built with mud and straw suddenly encountered pressure, economic, social, and legal, to change. Stone and timber began to symbolize status. Brick became the mark of progress. And Wattle and Daub, that became associated with poverty. As Europe moved into the late medieval and early modern eras, society itself was shifting. Trade expanded, tools improved, money flowed more freely. Skilled carpenters and masons became more available, and landowners wanted homes that displayed wealth, stability, and permanence. A mud-walled house, no matter how warm or sturdy, couldn't compete with the prestige of brick. Then came regulations. Some towns banned thatch entirely because it was considered a fire risk. After all, tightly packed medieval housing meant one stray spark could take out an entire street. As cities and towns spread their influence into the countryside, peasants were encouraged, or sometimes forced, to adopt new materials. Industrialization pushed the transformation even further. Factories could now mass-produce nails, glass panes, bricks, tiles, and saw-cut timber. These materials became cheaper and more accessible. They symbolized modernity, and mud houses suddenly looked old-fashioned, backward, something to be left behind. But perhaps the most powerful reason these humble homes disappeared was more emotional than practical. People wanted progress. After generations of struggling, peasants longed for something sturdier, something cleaner, something that didn't crumble if you pressed too hard or leak when the storms came. A brick house wasn't just a shelter, it was pride. And so, one family replaced their thatched roof with wooden shingles, another added brick around their doors, another rebuilt the entire house in stone. And generation by generation, the landscape changed. Mud walls were taken down, or covered, or simply abandoned to time. New houses rose, modern villages grew, and the ancient knowledge of Wattle and Daub quietly faded. Yet here's the beautiful irony. Today, centuries later, modern architects are rediscovering what peasants always knew: mudworks. Sustainable builders now study ancient techniques with wonder. They run their hands along surviving daub walls and marvel at their durability. They copy the same mixtures, clay, sand, straw, even manure, to build environmentally friendly homes. They test how well these structures regulate temperature and discover, to their surprise, that mud houses stay naturally cool in summer and warm in winter. Some now argue that peasant homes were among the most eco-friendly dwellings ever created. What peasants built out of necessity, we now admire as innovation. And perhaps that's the real legacy of these forgotten homes. They remind us that humans don't need endless resources, perfect conditions, or modern tools to create something functional, warm, and meaningful. They remind us of resilience, the kind that rises from the earth itself. The kind that says, we will survive, even with almost nothing. Mud houses teach us that ingenuity thrives under pressure, that community can raise, then walls where individuals cannot. That a home's value comes not from what it's made of, but from the lives it protects. And so, even though these structures have mostly disappeared from the landscape, they remain standing in the story of humanity. In every family that once gathered around a smoky fire, in every muddy handprint pressed against a drying wall, in every roof beam raised by neighbors working side by side. In the end, the peasants' greatest achievement wasn't the walls or the roof. It was the hope they shaped into a home. A hope mixed into every handful of mud, woven into every branch of wattle, carried into the future through the simple act of building something with love and purpose. And as we look back today, we realize something profound. They weren't just building houses. They were building survival, family, community, and the quiet strength that comes from making the best of whatever the earth gives you. A strength we still need, perhaps now more than ever.